Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. My name is Laura Lee, and I'm one of the education managers here at the museum. Welcome to our first Tenement Talk of the year. It's wonderful to see such a full house at the museum, and I'm really excited about tonight's conversation. I'm not going to spend too much time here because I want to turn things over to our distinguished panel. But I just wanted to say welcome, let you all know that we are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel, and we will have time for questions at the end. Because we are live streaming, we have a microphone that will go around just to make sure that your question is picked up for our audience who's watching and also everyone who's in the room. So when that time comes, just remember to wait for the microphone to come to you. Also, please silence your cell phones just to make sure that doesn't get picked up and disrupt our wonderful conversation. Tonight, in kind of honor of this event, we are promoting 2 books here in the shop if you all are interested in buying a couple of books on discount. We have Street Spirit by Stephen Crenshaw that has a foreword by Weiwei, and as well as Create Dangerously by Edgewood Dandicant. So both of those we're featuring tonight in honor of this evening's event, Immigrants Are Our Neighbors. So we have 3 people on the panel. I'm just going to give brief introductions and then turn things over to them. First, we have Kathryn Lloyd, who is the Director of Programs at the Tenement Museum. Kathryn helps develop the museum's education programming to inspire connections past and present. We also have Daniel S. Palmer, who is the Associate Curator at the Public Art Fund. Daniel is currently has curated exhibitions including Liz Gwynn's Open House and Commercial Break. He's also a contributor to numerous exhibition catalogs and publications as well. And last but not least, Anu Joshi, who is the Director of Immigration at Policy at the New York Immigration Coalition. Anu has worked there for 6 years, or has worked for the immigrants' rights movement for 6 years. Sorry about that. So we're really happy to have all of you here tonight for tonight's conversation. And thank you all for being here as well.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you all for joining us for what I'm really excited about will be a conversation that really explores how history and art and policy overlap, and how we can explore all of these things in the context of immigration in the United States. And just to get a sense, how many of you have visited the Tenement Museum before and been on one of our tours? Oh, great, wonderful. It's okay if you haven't, because today we're going to talk a little bit about one of the families that we explore on our newest tour, Under One Roof. But the museum, our 2 buildings have always carried the stories of how immigrants are our neighbors on the Lower East Side and in New York City. Up here we have 97 Orchard Street, and this building, 103 Orchard Street. Together, these 2 buildings were home to about 10,000 immigrants or migrants from 1863, when 97 Orchard Street opened as a residence, all the way through the 20th century. So now, the museum is able to explore the stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees from the middle of the 19th century all the way through to today. So when we were thinking about how we would really ground this story and this conversation in the place that we are right now, we thought that it would be perfect to really talk through one of the family stories from our newest tour, Under One Roof. And this tour, it's 2 floors above where we are right now, where we've recreated one apartment that was home to families in the middle of the 20th century. So here we see Bella and Belima Epstein. They were the daughters of Kalman and Rivka Epstein, who were Holocaust survivors and refugees who moved to the neighborhood in the 1940s. We see Jose Velez. He was the son of Romanita Rivera Saez, who moved here as a Puerto Rican migrant in the 1950s. And then finally we have Mrs. Wong and her son Kevin. They were Chinese immigrants who moved to the Lower East Side in the 1960s. So on our tour Under One Roof, we explore all 3 of these family stories. And it allows us, for the first time, to look at not just immigration stories to the Lower East Side, but migration stories of Puerto Ricans, and refugee stories. Because Bella and Blima Epstein, their parents were part of really the first group of people in the United States to be called refugees, where the US used that term. Now, the different thing about these family stories for us at the museum is that we got to talk to all of these people. We were able to work with the families to tell their story in the museum. And I wanted to start us out in understanding the story of Bella and Blima Epstein and their parents by watching a little video. And this video is actually Bella Epstein when she came back to this building about 5 years ago to start helping us tell the story of her childhood growing up in 103 Orchard Street. So what you'll see is really her first reaction to coming back to her childhood home on the Lower East Side. So that was just a few moments of what are many, many hours of conversation that we've been able to have with Bella Epstein about her experience growing up here and about her parents' experience as refugees arriving to the Lower East Side in 1947. And I think it's so important that she had those memories of the mezuzah in particular, because it's actually, it's on the outside of their door. And when I was thinking about sort of what Weiwei in his work asks us to do with his exhibit, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, is really to look closer at the things around us. And those things might be within our own apartment building hallways. That growing up in this building, Bella Epstein said that she always learned about her neighbors, not just through the friendships that she would form with, Rosetta Di Benedetto, who was a daughter of an Italian couple who lived in the building. She was best friends with Rosetta, but she also learned about her neighbors through the smells that would drift up through the air shaft, through the languages that she would hear sort of through the very thin New York walls, which I think probably many of us can relate to. But that mezuzah really for Bella was the symbol of her parents' bravery and of their faith in America to be a place where they could begin again. That Kalman and Rivka, Bella described them as very loving, very protective parents. Rivka, would cook meals every night for the family. So probably, what time? About 6:42. I feel like she'd probably be getting ready to sit everyone down to dinner. But she was also a mother who would paint the walls of the apartment blue, yellow, pink, colors that were Freilach, or happy in Yiddish. The home would be filled with Yiddish radio, with the sounds of Yiddish conversation. That Kalman, as a father, was strict, but also loving, and would take Bella with him to synagogue. And she was allowed to sit on the lower level with the men until she became 11 and a half and had to go sit upstairs in the Jewish Orthodox synagogue with the women. But Bella, she told us all of these stories of her and her parents' experience on the Lower East Side. But what she didn't realize until she was an adult was some of the things that they weren't telling her, and some of the conversations that they didn't have about how they arrived in the Lower East Side and what their past had been like in Europe, having survived the Holocaust and having been imprisoned in concentration camps. And Kalman and Rivka Epstein, they arrive in the Lower East Side in April of 1947, and they have a marriage celebration. And this is a photograph of Kalman and Rivka's wedding in New York City, and it was actually their second wedding. And they had their first marriage in a displaced persons camp where they met. And they were both, after the war, they were sent to displaced persons camps. This one was outside of Frankfurt in Germany. And they met and married there. And they were coming to the Lower East Side, coming into a neighborhood that had a couple of generations of history as a Jewish neighborhood. They easily would have found a synagogue to worship at, found kosher butchers to get the meat for whatever Rivka was making for dinner tonight. That there was a Jewish infrastructure already in place to welcome them when they arrived. But what there really wasn't was a lot of other refugees, a lot of other people in their situation. And that was really because of the policy conditions in which the Epsteins arrived in the Lower East Side. And we thought it would be helpful to provide some of that as we sort of think about the other pieces of this conversation. As part of the tour, we share Kalman and Rivka Epstein's declarations of intent to become citizens. They filed this paperwork just 3 months after arriving in 1947. So they arrive in April, they file their intent to become citizens in June of 1947. And this is almost 2 years after President Truman signs an executive order that allows in about 23,000 refugees to resettle in the United States. Kalman and Rivka, from the time the war ended to the time they were able to come here, wouldn't have been able to come to the Lower East Side or come to America. The U.S.'s immigration policy at the time had a strict quota system that really restricted the numbers of Eastern European and Southern European immigrants, so that during World War II, the U.S. was faced with this question of who do we allow in a refugee crisis? Do we need to adjust our immigration policy to allow for the global refugee crisis that the world was experiencing during World War II? And it wasn't until December of 1945 that President Truman signed this executive order after fear of congressional inaction. And this piece of legislation allowed in about 23,000 people like Kalman and Rivka, allowed them to resettle in the United States. But a key part of this legislation was actually both family and organizational sponsorship. So Kalman and Rivka, in resettling here, they were sponsored by family and by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which today still continues to do work with refugees, which has been a wonderful thing to talk about on our tour when we're talking about the Epsteins. Thinking about how a group like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society has, since the 19th century, helped newcomers resettle in the United States. And the family that sponsored Kalman and Rivka we see here. Jacob and Golda Epstein were Kalman's aunt and uncle. And we see them in a portrait on one side, and then on the other side we see them working in their dress shop that they had just a few blocks north of where we are now on Orchard Street. And Jacob and Golda Epstein, they'd lived in the Lower East Side since 1913, so they had about 3 decades of experience by the time they sponsored Kalman and Rivka to come here. And they were really part of this movement of individuals, and not just Jewish American individuals who during the years of World War II, where the U.S. wasn't adjusting its policy to allow in refugees, there was really an individual and organizational response from people like Jacob and Golda Epstein. They belonged to a group called the Kielce Benevolent Society, based in the hometown where they were from in Poland, Kielce. And this benevolent society, they held benefits, they raised money, they raised awareness for refugees who were stuck in Europe during the war. And Jacob and Golda, a few years before they officially sponsored Kalman and Rivka, were helping to raise awareness and to raise funds to bring refugees to the United States when the government was not adjusting their policy on newcomers and refugees. So the Epsteins, both Jacob and Golda and Kalman and Rivka and Bella and Blima, they were part of this Lower East Side that had been established as a welcoming community for immigrants and continued to evolve, of course, throughout the 20th century as families from different parts of the world start to arrive. And the final photo I want to share with you before I hand it over to Daniel to tell us about Weiwei's work. The final photo I want to share with you is that of the 3 families that we talk about on our tour Under One Roof, but today. I know, the photo always gets a good reaction, but we have in the center Bella Epstein. Bella got married, had children, later in life became a nurse. All of her and her husband's children became doctors or nurses. So we see her and her husband, her son, and their 3 grandchildren. Then we also have, to the right of Bella and her family, Jose and Migdalia, who are part of the Puerto Rican family that we talk about on this tour. And then Mrs. Wong and her daughter Yat Ping, who, again, lived in this building for many years. And what I loved, too, thinking about Ai Weiwei's work and his sort of response to the current conversation that we find ourselves in around immigrants and refugees, is that Ai Weiwei lived in this neighborhood at the same time that some of these families lived in this neighborhood. And he's, in a way, part of, the Chinese immigration and the shift that happens in the second half of the 20th century. And that was a connection I'd never made before. So it was nice sort of thinking about him not only as an artist and his work in response to, to immigration and our migration crisis, but also just as a person and an immigrant himself living in New York in the 1980s. Now, one final thought before I turn it over to Daniel. I know I said I would stop, but one more thing to say is that when we talk to all these families, I mean, when we brought them together, I know they all look like they were best friends, but many of them didn't know each other. And in reflection, they said, we weren't good friends with any of our neighbors who spoke different languages or held different beliefs, but we felt this sense that the Lower East Side taught us that America was a diverse place, and that was part of being American, was being welcoming to people who were different from you. And these people now live all across the country: Seattle, Florida, Puerto Rico, DC. So we bring them back now to help us continue telling this story. And certainly that story extends out into the Lower East Side neighborhood, where, if you walk around, you'll see a lot of Ai Weiwei's current work. So this is where I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to tell us a little bit about the next piece.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to pull up some notes here and a timer and whatnot. I am thrilled to get to share. How do we change the presentation over? Is the question I have? Maybe it just advances on the next one. Perfect. There we go. So I'm thrilled to share a little bit of our exhibition, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. I myself, as the introduction said, am one of the curators at Public Art Fund. We're the New York City-based nonprofit who put together this exhibition actually as the culmination of our 40th anniversary year. So we've been putting public artworks all throughout New York City for 40 years. I've been thrilled to be a part of the team to develop this project and to get to help sort of bring it to fruition, but really an enormous thanks is really due to the entirety of the team and all of the various other city agencies that we partnered with. Like I said, we're independent, but for a project like this, you can imagine it really was only possible thanks to the support of the city and to a lot of other partners who we collaborated with on this project. And so, the beginnings of this exhibition, in terms of the dialogue between Public Art Fund and Ai Weiwei, really came when about 8 years ago or so, our director and chief curator, Nicholas Baum, who was the lead curator on this project, when he joined up with Public Art Fund and he reached out to Weiwei, said, you seem like a really important international artist who has some relationship with New York City. Maybe you'd be interested in doing something here, and he invited him to start that conversation. Weiwei was obviously really excited to develop a project, but it was only really because of circumstances that we'll discuss, and really about a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago, that we were able to develop this project really in earnest. And an enormous part of that, you can imagine, had to do with the fact that he was a voice of freedom and democracy in China who was really silenced. There's no other way to put it. He was silenced when he was incarcerated by the Chinese government, made to disappear, and then finally was freed, but still was living under house arrest. And it was only really when he was given his passport back and he fled into exile in Berlin, where he's currently living and has set up his studio, that he was able to start to travel to New York again and to really think about what it would mean to create a public artwork here for the city and the people of New York City. And so that's where the story, I think, really picks back up, is that you know, there was actually actually a backstory to that as well, in the sense that him coming back to New York City around, I'd say, 2016 for, you know, the visits that developed into to this project, that it was also sort of a moment for Weiwei to be walking down memory lane, because he lived here in New York City and he really had such an important and seminal period of his life here, when he lived first as a student here from he came in 1982, and he was first a student, but then actually dropped out of school and was living here as a young artist, really trying to kind of make his way and connecting with other young artists here, and especially the Chinese artistic expat community that was based here, but also getting to know other artists and poets. He actually became very close with Allen Ginsberg and a few others at that moment. And he lived here until about 1992. And so this was something that we knew, and was a part of him being, you know, invited to think through his time here as an immigrant in the city. But what we didn't actually know was that for a significant portion of that time, he was actually an illegal immigrant here in New York City. And this is something that was not really ever written about in the literature, you know, in other sort of art historical pieces about Weiwei and his time here in New York City. We have great photos like this, and we have other pictures that he took of the protests that were happening around at that moment, and especially around the sort of the life of the Lower East Side and of the area nearby where we are now, and where a lot of the installations of the exhibition are. But the fact that that he was actually an illegal immigrant here at that point also connected us, you know, helped us understand that role of exile, that theme of exile in his life, and how, you know, he's currently living in exile in Berlin. He had this moment where he was, you know, partly a bit of a self-exile to come here and be a student and learn, but then also it made us understand the importance of this role in his life, because his father, it also should be said, was a very famous poet who fell out of favor and was banished to a remote province where he and his family lived, and that was Weiwei's, you know, some of Weiwei's earliest memories were living there and having to watch his father clean, you know, a toilet bowl with a toothbrush and do hard manual labor. So this is sort of maybe a long-winded intro to say that so much of this exhibition is deeply personal for Ai Weiwei, and, you know, comes from this personal place of his own relationship to the city and his own relationship to these themes and issues. But then it expanded from there, obviously, because of the global refugee crisis and all of the sort of migration that was going on around the world at that time. And especially where many of the people who were fleeing North Africa or Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan were trying to make their way to Europe, and especially to Berlin, where he was living. And so he became enormously you know, interested in actually going to the sites where a lot of this migration was happening, and going to the points where people were trying to enter Europe, or, you know, other sort of significant borders around the world, such as, you know, borders, America's southern border, for example. And this was the beginnings of what has turned into his documentary film titled Human Flow, that is out in theaters, and I encourage everyone to see. It's incredibly powerful. But that also from there, he was able to take and think about those issues and ideas, and to sort of combine them with the project that we were developing, which turned into the exhibition Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, and collectively sort of for all of these, to serve all of this exhibition and all of that film and all of the other work he's been doing, to really to serve as a plea for empathy for migrants and for immigrants, and to really challenge the definitions of borders and restrictions, and frankly to show their absurdity. I mean, the title of the exhibition, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, really comes from a Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, but it's meant to challenge the idea that a fence is a good thing. It's the sort of folk wisdom that the foe in the Robert Frost poem keeps repeating as a refrain, and it's meant to be challenged. And so so the real core of our exhibition then in that regard was to take this motif of the fence, to take the theme of the fence and especially of the cage, and to interject into the fabric of the city all throughout the entirety of the city, actually, and through all 5 boroughs of the city, these fences as almost like a fence in quotations, a fence that is clearly, you know, meant to illustrate that it actually serves no purpose. It's pointless, you know, and by extension, encouraging us to question and challenge all fences and all borders that we put up between ourselves and others. And so, especially with, you know, one of the most dramatic pieces in the exhibition, which is the piece under the Washington Square Arch, you know, this, it seems to put up a border, a restriction through the free passageway of a symbol of freedom and independence, you know, a monument to this country's first president. But it certainly then has a pointlessness. It has a opening that opens up right through the center of it that is actually, you see it's in the silhouette of an embracing couple. Now this also has some art historical references. It harks back to Marcel Duchamp and the fact that Duchamp used to play chess in the park, and Weiwei is obsessed with Duchamp and used to spend time in the park as well himself. But I think also for me personally, it shows that, you know, that the love of a partner really is the way that that we can overcome these challenges that are put up between people that are meant to separate or divide us. And I think that really is something that I know that, you know, Weiwei has talked about in relationship to borders and to these restrictions. And just to sort of run quickly maybe through some of the other works, and we can kind of talk about them a little bit more in depth in some of the dialogue. We also did a piece at Doris C. Friedman Plaza, which is at the southeast corner of Central Park, 60th Street and 5th Avenue, which is a plaza that is actually named after our founder, the founder of Public Art Fund, and where we always curate public art installations. This piece, The Gilded Cage, was clearly also, I mean, I'll say it, it's gold, and this was Weiwei's quote, it's gold because, you know, there's a penthouse not so far from there at the top of Trump Tower, and he knows that there's a president in there who likes gold a lot, you know, so, but also it's about the idea of what does it mean to live in a gilded cage, you know, how can borders and fences not only keep others out, but keep yourself in. And so I think with a piece like this, he certainly, was making quite a profound statement in that. Also, one of the largest installations in the exhibition is out in Queens at the Unisphere at Flushing Meadows Corona Park, which is a 1,000-foot long perimeter sort of mesh netting fence there that partly Weiwei was really attracted to the site because of the relationship of the World's Fairs and especially of the UN at that site, but also you can imagine this relates to the demographics of the city and especially to Queens, and that's something important to say for all of the installations, and the fact that there are 323 works in the exhibition throughout all 5 boroughs is that the history of Weiwei's own personal time here in the city and where some of the works are located relates to that, but it also relates to the history of immigration in the city, and that's also why there's a great concentration of works down around here, where there was a large immigrant population at the early 20th century and even a little before that. But then also we wanted to make sure that we were incorporating the current landscape of where immigrants tend to live and make their way in the city, and so we were working with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to get lots of data from them and to make sure that the overall arrangement of the exhibition and the placement of works did relate to those patterns as well, and was meant to be as inclusive and welcoming and engaging as possible in that way. And then, one of the sort of main motifs that you can see in these next group of works are sort of fences on buildings. These are works that are meant to sort of show partly the absurdity of a fence and the fact that there's no reason for a fence to be on a rooftop like that. Who is it keeping out? But also in a way that it kind of seems like it's connecting the two neighbors in this way as well, the neighboring buildings. And it's important to note, this is the building on East 7th Street, right next to the basement apartment where Weiwei lived for part of his time here. And then there are also works around bus shelters and transportation hubs throughout the city. And then you see they also have images on the bus shelter advertising platforms that are, a lot of these are photographs that Weiwei took throughout his travels to all of these borders and checkpoints as well. Other works on newsstand kiosks, and at Essex Market, not so far from here, there's a really beautiful piece that's a sort of, that's a kind of silhouetted journey of migrants that he's highlighting there. And then there's the lamppost banner component of the artwork. And so these are 200 lamppost banners that are individual portraits throughout all of the 5 boroughs. A significant portion of them are historic immigrants to the city based on Augustus Sherman photographs. He was an Ellis Island clerk that was documenting people coming to the city. And then there's a large group of them that are portraits of prominent refugees, prominent exiles, people who have sort of had their lives defined by exile in their lives, and then a group of contemporary refugees and exiles as well, who Weiwei encountered in his journey. And I really have to say, because I know there's a ton of work in the show and not a ton of time to talk about too much more of it, but our website, publicartfund.org, has an interactive map. It's mobile optimized, so if you pull it up anywhere in the city, it'll tell you where the nearest artwork is to you and tell you how to get to other artworks. And the exhibition is up for a short time further. We opened on October 12th, but we'll close on February 11th. So I encourage you to see as many of these in the meantime. Oh, so this is just a sort of a grouping of some of the ones that I was just describing. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't think my presentation is going to be as optimistic as the 2 were that came before me, so I'll apologize for that in advance. Like Laura said, my name is Anu Joshi, and I'm at the New York Immigration Coalition. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're facing right now in terms of immigration and the threats to immigration and immigrants in this country. So we know that since the beginning of the campaign even, this president, President Trump, has sort of talked nonstop about his desire to build a wall, and sometimes a fence, but usually a wall along the southern border. And in stump speeches over the last 2 years, I don't even know how much time he spent on talking about how this wall separating us from our neighbors will be good for America and it will be good for Americans. Now, I can bore you with all of the stats and facts, imagine that, about why that's just not true. We know that unauthorized border crossings are at the lowest that they've been in decades, that many people who are here undocumented actually came here legally and overstayed their visas, so a wall wouldn't do anything to prevent that, that a wall won't actually keep people or drugs out because tunnels can be built and ladders can be used. But we all know that that wasn't actually the point of Trump's wall, right? And I want to quote a congressman from Chicago, Representative Gutierrez, because I think he gets it exactly right. It would be far cheaper to erect a 50-foot concrete statue of a middle finger and point it towards Latin America. Both the wall and the statue would be equally offensive and equally ineffective, and both would express Trump's deeply held suspicion of Latinos. So this is kind of where we are right now. One good thing is, at least as of today, it seems like our New York Senator Schumer, is going to stand firm against giving the president the $25 billion, that's billion, that he wants to build this wall along the southern border. So what I want to talk today actually is about a virtual wall that President Trump and others in Congress are really sneakily trying to insert into the negotiations that are happening around protecting dreamers. So, last September, Trump made the immoral decision to terminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And that program protected about 700,000 immigrants that were brought here as children. It protected them from deportation, it allowed them to work and support their families, and last September, the president decided to end it. Now, this is a program that 87% of Americans support, and even 67% of Republicans support this issue. So, there's a lot of pressure on Congress to do their job, to get this done, to pass a DREAM Act, which would protect these young people. Unfortunately, we have a white nationalist in the White House, and he's emboldened white nationalist voices in Congress and around the country. And so I really want to talk about 3 threats to our legal immigration system that will really, if they're allowed to be enacted, and in some cases some already have, serve as that virtual barrier to prevent immigrants from coming in and making this country their home. And as we all know, making this country better. So the first one, and all 3 of these, actually 2 of these, he mentioned last night in the State of the Union. So they might sound a little bit familiar for any of those of you who could stomach watching it. I did, and I was furiously Facebooking, and it was, I watched so you didn't have to. So the first one I want to talk about is the Diversity Visa Lottery Program. Who has heard of the Diversity Visa Lottery Program? Great. Okay. So the Diversity Visa Lottery Program was created in the early 90s. Actually, Chuck Schumer was one of the people who played a large role in creating the program. And it provides a limited amount of green cards, so about 50,000 green cards a year, which is about 4% of the total amount of green cards that the U.S. gives to immigrants every year. So it provides about 50,000 green cards to individuals from countries with traditionally low levels of immigration to the United States. And it was created in the 90s as a way to kind of try to level the playing field a little bit and provide immigrants from countries that have no other means to get here the chance, the opportunity. And the program is kind of incredible, right? So right now, it predominantly impacts people from African countries, specifically sub-Saharan African countries, Asian countries, and the Caribbean are kind of where the most of the 50,000 visas go. And every year, like I said, there's 50,000 slots. On average, 16 million people apply. And that's just for the chance, for the opportunity to try to get one of these visas to come to this country and make it their home. You have to have a high school diploma or 2 years work experience, and you apply, and they choose. If you get chosen, you have to go through all of the same steps that any other immigrant has to go through. Background checks, you have to do 15 years of addresses and work history, you have to turn over your social media accounts, you have to do an in-person interview, all of those same things. And if you can make it through all of that, then you get a green card, and you're able to come to this country and eventually, 5 years later, apply for citizenship. Now, this is a program that has come under attack by this administration, and actually has the honor of being one of the inspirations, or motivations for President Trump calling 55 African countries, Haiti and El Salvador, shitholes. Specifically, he was talking about this program that gives people from African countries and others a chance, an idea, an opportunity to come to the United States. And so both the White House and members of Congress, including Republicans and Democrats, have talked about eliminating this program altogether. So taking these 50,000 visas that right now are allocated to the diversity visa and reallocating them to programs that already exist. So this is one instance of this administration of trying to erect this virtual barrier. The second program that I want to talk about is something called Temporary Protected Status. Has anyone heard of TPS? Oh, great. So Temporary Protected Status is a program that allows foreign nationals who are living in the U.S. Without papers, who are undocumented, to remain in this country if for some reason they cannot be returned to their home country. And so that could include natural disaster, political disaster, whether it's ongoing or a one-time event. So for example, Nepal was granted temporary protected status after the devastating earthquake about a decade ago. Haiti was granted temporary status after the earthquake, and then again the cholera outbreak, and then the hurricanes. And so, many of these people, like the 195,000 people from El Salvador who have temporary protected status, have been living in this country for decades. There's about 305,000 people with temporary protected status right now. They're protected from deportation. They're able to work and support their family. They have 295,000 U.S. citizen children. Over a third of them own their homes. 88% of them are working. And they are integral members of our society. They're our neighbors. They're our family. They're our friends. They have put roots down here. And this administration, over the last 5 months, has terminated TPS for Sudan, Nicaragua, Haiti, and El Salvador, meaning that in a year to a year and a half, these almost 250,000 people will be stripped of their protections and pushed into the shadows, or worse, deported, leaving behind their U.S. citizen kids, or making a difficult choice, leave their kids here or take them with them to countries that are not prepared to repatriate hundreds of thousands of their citizens who are still struggling in the aftermaths of these natural or man-made disasters. Today we had a decision earlier today that the administration did renew temporary protected status for Syria for 18 months, which was really great news. But they did not redesignate it. So they said no one new can apply for this program. And in doing so, they basically said that, Syria's fine, you can return to Syria. And as we know, Syria is literally a war zone. They do not have a functioning government, and no one can return to Syria, at least not right now. And so with TPS, what we've seen is, this administration will go to any lengths to implement an agenda that aggressively targets people of color and immigrants, regardless of any, outstanding factors. The last issue that I want to talk about is probably the most insidious, and is actually directly relevant to a conversation and to this building when we're talking about what Kat mentioned earlier. So some of you might have been following, but the president and certain members of Congress, senators, have been aggressively speaking out against something they call chain migration. Have people heard this phrase be used? Yeah. The reason that they call it chain migration, which is not actually a phrase that exists anywhere in our immigration policy, is because they don't want to use the word family. And the reality is that the policy that they're advocating for is a family ban. Right now, if you're a U.S. citizen, you are allowed to sponsor your children, your siblings, or your parents for green cards. Now, if your child is under 21, and if it's your spouse, then they're an immediate relative. You can apply, and they can go through the process, and they just have to go through the process, and they can get a green card. If it's an adult child or your parent, then you enter into a backlog, and you'll have to wait until a green card becomes available. Green card holders can sponsor their unmarried adult children, but they go into a backlog, and they have to wait. And for some of these, if you're a U.S. citizen trying to bring your brother or sister over, the wait can be 12 to 20 years, right? So this is not a quick process that we're talking about. And what this administration wants to do, what Senators Cotton from Arkansas and Perdue from Georgia want to do, is they want to eliminate the ability of U.S. citizens to sponsor their parents for green cards or their adult children, anyone over the age of 18. And I don't know about you, but when I was 19, I still considered myself my parents' children. And they want to eliminate the ability of green card holders to sponsor their adult children altogether. And this, basically what they're trying to do is reduce legal immigration to this country by 50%. So, lawmakers that purport to be about family values should really value families. Family has been the cornerstone of our immigration policy since the 1960s. Families are what help immigrants assimilate into their communities. Families are the ways that immigrants thrive, how they can start businesses, how they can make connections, and really contribute everything they can to this country. And the reality is that this is not really about whether or not we want to admit people based on family ties or based on educational level or whether they can speak English. The reality is that this is an attempt by this administration, by President Trump, to simply maintain a white majority in this country. And the way to do that is by limiting immigration altogether. And that's what these proposals do. And what that really does is that erects a virtual wall around us as a country. You know, my parents immigrated here from India, and I was born here. And when I was a kid, my mom was able to sponsor her parents for a green card. And they were able to come, and they took care of me as both my parents worked. They raised me, they loved me, and I know that I'm a better American because I was able to be close to my grandparents. They were able to love me, I was able to learn the language, and I wouldn't have had that opportunity if my mom had not been allowed to sponsor her parents. And that's what this government wants to prevent. And I know that as a country, we will not be greater, we will not be safer if people like my mom, if my grandparents couldn't have lived with us when I was growing up. So I hate to be the Debbie Downer of the group, but you know, this is what we're facing right now. And so the last thing I'll say is that there is hope. The New York Immigration Coalition and hundreds of organizations are fighting back. And right now, we have the fight of our lives on our hands to get a DREAM Act passed through this Congress and signed by the President. This Congress has until February 8th to get something done. New York Immigration Coalition will be in DC next week. We're hosting phone banks to call Senator Schumer and make sure that he understands how important this is. So we'd love for all of you to come out and support as much as you can.
Thank you so much, Anu and Daniel. I'm going to see if I can figure out, here we go, how to get this off the stand so we can open up the conversation a little bit more. I mean, I think there's so many connections in what you both said that I want to scrap the questions I had planned and ask more. But one question that kept coming up, especially as we at the museum talk all day, every day about the power of individuals and organizations and communities to respond to concerns and crises like what we were facing during World War II, like what we're facing today. We think so much about these responses that I'm really curious to sort of hear from both of your perspectives, what are some of those individual or organizational responses that you have seen in the face of either government inaction or, you know, poor decisions by the government?
I can certainly say that, you know, the idea of a wall or a fence being so sort of dominating the election campaign was a big part of why Weiwei really hit on that idea of like, oh, you think fences and walls are important? Let's make a citywide exhibition of them. I mean, I think that's certainly one personal response to it. He's not an American citizen, but this was was and continues to be a global conversation. But then I think on the other side of it, it's been so heartening to me to see the way that this exhibition has been, has achieved its intention of starting a conversation and of being a sort of touchstone for a conversation. I mean, I think there's obviously many other things beyond just art in the world, and especially going on right now. But I think it's really I don't know. It's inspiring that one of the world's foremost artists would have wanted to harness this, this opportunity of a citywide exhibition to address these issues, and the fact that so many people have responded so positively to it. And I think a big part of that is that it's about New York City. I mean, I think this installation in a lot of other places might not necessarily have done the same thing, but he wanted, I think, partly to remind us how lucky we are here in New York City. And how much we've really gained by having all of these different communities come together. And I think that's where your intro and like this building and the intention of this institution is really central to that, to helping us remember that, but also to show that it's really, that it's ongoing, that it continues today, and that's really what makes us all, this country and this city so great in the first place.
Yeah, I'll say, we just commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the Muslim and refugee ban last weekend. And I will say that was, 1 year ago today, NYIC was at JFK. My coworker was setting up a legal clinic in the Terminal 4 at the diner, and we had 10,000 people show up at the airport, within hours, and it's not like JFK is that easy to get to. So these people were committed to, publicly expressing how frustrated they were with the direction that this country was going in and what had happened in November. And I don't think, I think that's kind of ebbed and flowed over the course of the last year, looking back at where we are now from where we were back then. But I don't think the intensity has lessened. And so that gives me a lot of hope. We had 10,000 people out at JFK. We had 30,000 people out in Battery Park the next day. It was incredible. And a part of me was nervous, was everyone going to come out in the first week, and then, we weren't going to see anyone ever again. And what the DREAM Act, the fight for the DREAM Act now going on, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, has made me realize that, no, we are a community, and we are so lucky to be here in New York City, surrounded by people who understand why this is so important, and that commitment just needs to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you both already mentioned things that connect to the next question that I was curious to hear about, and that's really about New York, and whether we can say that New York is somehow exceptional as a welcoming place for immigrants. Because certainly the Under One Roof tour, a lot of what we have been exploring is how these families, who again now live all across the United States, still feel connected to the Lower East Side, and in many cases still consider themselves New Yorkers, even though some of them haven't lived in New York for 30, 40 years. So, what we've been exploring on the tour is, is it New York? Is there something about New York, and is there something especially about the density of New York, about, these apartment buildings, these tenement buildings that people call today their homes, that help us see how good fences maybe aren't necessary to make good neighbors, and just the ways in which New York, we can help understand this through the lens of New York City. I ended with not a question, but what do you think? Is it New York?
I have things to say. I think first and foremost, I personally am just so grateful to live here in New York. I think there's so many interesting different people who I encounter on a daily and weekly basis. But I also think, you can get that in other places too. And I think that's really a strength of this country and its history of welcoming immigrants, and of other places around the world that have a more cosmopolitan dimension to them. But I also think it's important that for this exhibition, at least, that Weiwei wasn't interested in alienating or in saying like, oh, this is something that is so great here at New York that nobody in the rest of the world has. I think actually one of the things that we always think about when we're creating public art for New York City, especially at the entrance to the Central Park or something like this, that so many people from all around the world are going to come here on their vacation and are going to see it and experience it. And I think it's actually that much more, even more powerful to say that I'm sure the millions of people who walked under the arch who are from a red state or a red district or another part of the world who are only here for a week or a weekend or whatever, that they are able to hopefully think a little bit more about these issues and ideas. So public space in New York City is so vibrant, has always been so vibrant, but also public space around the world right now, and the way that smartphones and Instagram and, you know, the way that we share images, how that's changed our relationship to space as well, I think has really actually changed the landscape of what it means to do a public art installation in these kinds of ways.
So I've lived in New York for about 18 months, and I already consider myself a New Yorker. Yeah, there is something special about here, but you know, there's also something very typical about New York State, at least. You know, we as a state, we don't, for example, provide driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, as 12 other states, DC and Puerto Rico, do. You know, so if you live outside of the city, if you live near the northern border, you know, there are CBP checkpoints very often, and our community members are getting caught up in those dragnets. We don't have a farm worker justice bill in this state, and it's, you know, they've been fighting for that for years. So there are many ways that New York still lags behind, you know, many other parts of the country, and a part of the work that we do at NYIC is making sure that, you know, we're keeping that front and center and reminding people that it's still tough to be an immigrant here. You know, New York City, even in New York City, it's still tough to be an immigrant here. And that it's on us, it's our responsibility to be the counteraction to what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, but also to move the needle forward. And that, you know, we shouldn't accept how it is right now as how it has to be.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, such an excellent point, because certainly, you know, we can feel like we are in a bubble in New York, and finding ways to sort of examine that a little closer is a lot of what we do at the Tenement Museum, and just think a little bit more deeply about the communities that we live in, and the communities that others live in throughout New York, and how those experiences of immigrants or migrants match or don't those in other parts of the country, certainly.
Can I actually ask you a question about the museum? Do you tend to find, and maybe it's changed in recent years as well, that that most of the people who come, most of the visitors who come, are actually New Yorkers or people who are coming from further away? I mean,
it's actually sort of a perfect split, about a third metro area, about a third of national visitors, and a third international. So, you know, some of our most interesting conversations with visitors happen when we have people from other states, other countries, sharing their experiences with, you know, either their own families or the immigrant and migrant communities in which they live, and sort of bringing that perspective to the New York perspective that we have here at the Tenement Museum. And actually, some of those visitor experiences inspired us a few years ago to start an online exhibit called Your Story, Our Story, where we collect stories of immigrants and migrants all across the country. So I spent this morning reading stories from 6th graders in Oklahoma who submitted their family's immigrant or migrant story to this website. So, you know, having those as part of now the museum collection is allowing us to have a little bit of a broader range, and sort of explore what is the experience of people across the country.
that's great, and that actually is a part of our exhibition too. On our website, we have an opportunity for people to sort of tell their own stories, so it's related.
Yeah, which I think is such an important part of the work that we do, is not just telling other stories, but inviting people to tell their own stories, and have those stories be part of our museum collection. So we could probably keep talking for like another 2 hours, but we'd love to bring you all into the conversation. So how this is going to work is Sally is going to bring around microphones for those of you who have questions, and a polite reminder to just hand Sally back the microphone when you're done.
Thank you very much. I'm all over this conversation. I'm going to be 75 years old this coming Friday, so I've lived through a lot of this stuff. My parents were immigrants to this country. My father's sister came in 1947 with her husband and her 2 children and lived with us until they got an apartment. I didn't realize that the number was so small. You say 23,000. I guess they were among the 23,000. They came from a DP camp in Germany. Yeah. Anyway, 2 things that weren't mentioned. Very important changes in our immigration policy. The first is in the 1920s. We used to have wide open immigration. You didn't have to have green cards or passports or anything. If you came from Europe, you just got here, and the only people that were turned away at Ellis Island were sick people, particularly with TB. And you just marched into this country, and you made your way and somehow found work, maybe with relatives, and chain migration. That lasted until 1924 or 25. 24.
Yeah, that started in 1924.
When we went through one of our most racist eras, which is not unlike what is happening right now. Catholics in those times, in the mid-20s, were regarded like Muslims are now. Tremendous anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment cut the immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe practically to zero, and immigration was restricted to people from Northwestern Europe who were living pretty well and didn't really want to come here anyway. So we didn't get any immigration in the last half of the 20s, and certainly not during the 30s and during the war, when so many people whose lives could have been saved were kept away by a restrictive immigration policy, which did not change until 1965, when President Johnson signs the new immigration bill at the Statue of Liberty, which changes the whole game, which allows two things that you didn't mention. Two kinds of people come here. I don't know how many other people are old enough to remember the conversation piece, the brain drain. We got the people from the brain drain. We had passed a couple of years earlier, I hope you don't mind me going on and on like this. A couple of years earlier, we had passed the Medicare and Medicaid. We were short of doctors. I don't know how many of you, but you're mostly young people. I go to the doctors all the time. I can't remember the last time I went to a medical professional that was native. They're all foreign-born, and they all come here easily because we let in doctors because we need them. At the same time, we let in people who brought money to start small businesses. All over New York, so many of the small businesses are begun by immigrants. They come in here with a couple $100,000, and they start a small business, and other people hire them. But this whole thing, I'll just wrap it up. 120, 30 years ago, there were no passports and green cards and all this stuff. People moved with guts. And these were the people who were able to tear themselves away from the religions and the cultures of their origin and come and start a new life and do something for themselves rather than maintain their culture. And we got so many of these wonderful people.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, of course. So Anu can respond first, and then I wanted to make a couple of connections. But
Thanks so much for that. You reminded me, I just want to make a point that at 23,000, now it's only 40,000, that the level for refugees that they set this year, which is the lowest it's been since the 1980s, when the need right now is so great, as we know. And the number is set at 40,000, but the number of refugees we've actually let in is something less than 10,000, which will mean that we won't even meet that 40,000 mark this year. And it's kind of unconscionable that as a country we would abdicate our responsibility to the rest of the world when we have these examples that we were supposed to learn from, right? That's what's really so heart-wrenching, is that we have these examples like here, the stories of the people here, and we haven't learned anything, or it feels that way at least.
yeah, certainly. And one of the things that President Truman said when he issued the executive order in 1945, which, of course, he has to issue that order because we had the restrictive quota that was set by the 1924 law. So, there were about around 26,000 people who would have been able to come from Germany every year. That was like the number of visas that was allowed, which, of course, the people who were displaced by the war were about 250,000. So the visas that were allotted were nowhere near the number of people who needed aid and assistance after the war. So President Truman, in issuing this order, he said that this was a chance for the U.S. to set an example in cooperating in the alleviation of human suffering. And I think that that's, a quote that it's so important for us to remember now in all of our organizational or individual fights against the conversation that we see here. because Truman was responding in a time where many people had concerns about Jewish immigrants in the same way that we might see people having concerns about other populations of immigrants or refugees today. But you also make a great point about the 1965 law and how that totally transforms our country. That's been a big part of the stories that we tell in this new tour, because the Chinese family, the Wangs, they come here just sort of after the 1965 law reshapes immigration in the United States to allow more people to resettle here who had previously been shut out. Yeah, certainly.
Hi, thank you all. This question is primarily for Anu, and last night in this speech, I read the transcript, you couldn't listen to it. He referred to unaccompanied minors as a loophole in the policy, in immigration policy. And as you know, these are children who fled on their own from their home country seeking refuge. And so that because they didn't come with their parents, they're not included and will never be included in any sort of dream bill. What do you think can be done to help protect them? I mean, there's got to be at least 100,000 of them who don't have status.
Yeah, it's a great question. And right now we're seeing a resurgence, actually, from the 3 Central American countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And we have, many unaccompanied minors living here in New York on Long Island and in the city. There's a couple of things I'll say. We know that this president and a number of other elected officials, their goal is to do everything they can to vilify and criminalize immigrants. And a part of that is really using this framework of gang activity to try to advance this narrative. And unfortunately, that means that unaccompanied children get caught up in this attempt to criminalize all immigrants. And we don't just see it by the president, but on all levels. There's a couple of things that I think are hopeful. Right now, U.S. law is that the government must protect these children and give them a day in court. And that cannot change unless there is a change in U.S. law. Now, that's not to say that Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice that are implementing these laws are always going to do so fairly, but at least as of right now, unless Congress, takes an affirmative step, the law is that they have to be protected. And so that's kind of where we are right now. I think there is a risk because the administration has been threatening to detain these children, so keep them in jail, basically, until they have their day in court, and they don't have lawyers. In New York, that is one thing that we can say. In New York City, they do have lawyers, and that makes a huge difference. So, I don't have a good answer for you, but it's definitely something that we're watching.
What has been the public response to the Weiwei exhibit, and has Trump had any reaction to it?
She said he doesn't even know about it. I tend to think that's actually probably the case. There are, a number of installations around Trump Tower and whatnot, but I actually am not sure he's been back to New York during the run of the exhibition. And frankly, that's sort of neither here nor there, because the other side of it, the other part of your question, is that the public response has just been so heartwarming. It's been so, it's really, it's a testament to the artist that the exhibition has really hit its mark, that he was intending this as a plea for empathy for displaced people around the world and for people who are immigrants, exiles, migrants, and everybody, who's written in and called in or posted on social media about the exhibition has done so with so much passion and enthusiasm, and that's been really inspiring. And I think it's partly because of the moment we're in, and partly of these issues that we're talking about right now. It's like, it's such a critical moment right now, and we need to really double down on support of people who need our support and who need us as allies. So it's been an honor, I have to say, for me to get to work with Weiwei to help make this happen, and to see all these positive responses has been really, really wonderful.
Building on that, do you see the role of art and arts-based activism as being primarily one of a battle for hearts and minds that may obliquely impact policies or things like that? Or do you see coordination going on between arts-based activism and people who are fighting for policy and justice and other levels? Like, where are people merging their efforts?
Well, I think that, artists are always some of the most insightful respondents to the world around them. I partly am just so inspired by the way that artists have a capability for abstract thinking and for seeing things that the rest of us, partly because we're usually focused on our daily lives or on producing things, or living in that way, that we don't necessarily, we don't give ourselves the opportunity to see. And I think that what was so special about this exhibition, and really so many of the artists that I've had the honor to work with, is that they really do understand that what they do doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think that's been a part of the reason why public art has become so vital in recent years, is that the last part of it, sort of, I think, to speak to your question, is that that artists realize, and art institutions, and I think we all are starting to realize that there's such a potential to speak directly to people, and maybe it's not necessarily going to be trying to convince them of something, because maybe that sort of is more what propaganda does, but open up an opportunity for people to see differently, to see the world differently, and that's been where I've been so just thrilled to see the response to this exhibition, and to see that more and more artists are sort of taking that as their mandate and as their interest to help the world see things differently, not in a sort of heavy-handed way, but in a way that uses their skills and talents and harnesses that power.
Can I want to just mention that the DREAM Act, was first introduced in 2001, so 16 and a half, 17 years ago. So this is not a new concept, and in 2001, 87% of Americans definitely did not support it. The last time it came up for a vote, 2010, it fell 5 votes short in the Senate, otherwise we would have the DREAM Act, and 5 Democrats voted no. So the DREAM Act has had quite a trajectory in terms of public opinion and perception, and even within the Democratic Party. And a part of that has been, and I think of this as kind of an art form, is storytelling. And the kind of undocumented and unafraid theme that happened over the course of the last decade, really prompting dreamers, undocumented young people to come out and tell their own stories in ways that made sense to them and were honest for them, was really incredible. And the impact that has had on public opinion, I think, is immeasurable. I mean, well, it is measurable, we've seen it, but the impact that those stories have really had when people understood who these people were, who these individuals were. And that's happened so creatively. I mean, some of you might remember, but before the 2010 vote, a group of dreamers walked from Florida to DC, telling their story along the way. And that was it was an incredible moment, right? Of people really feeling, identifying with someone that maybe they had nothing in common with. And so that, I think of that as the power of art and storytelling to really shift perception. So that's one thing I would mention.
Yeah, and certainly at the Tenement Museum, we think about that power of storytelling, as so similar to what you both mentioned, where, you may read about the 1924 Quota Act, and that's all fine and good. You can learn about the legislation, but what happens when you learn about an Italian family, the Baldizis, where the mother and father were separated by that policy. The father had arrived, they lived at 97 Orchard Street, and the father arrived in 1923. The mother was unable to then because of this policy and had to come through other ways. So we think every day about how we tell personal stories to better understand policy and legislation, and even just these words like immigration that can seem so vague. Putting faces and stories and words and historic context to that, and connecting all of that to our visitors' personal stories is the work that we do every day that we hope certainly helps people connect to what's going on now.
Buenas noches. Por favor, si puede traducirme.
Bueno, vamos a ver.
Un poquito, ¿ya? Soy de Ecuador, soy un inmigrante de Ecuador. La pregunta es, ¿el poder estigmatiza, criminaliza, excluye? Y las políticas siguen con fuerza todavía con el presidente actual. ¿Hacia dónde apunta con esto? Digamos, ¿qué es lo que en ese contexto jugamos los inmigrantes? ¿En qué posición? Porque nos ven como seres de segunda clase o de tercera y de ahí para abajo, ¿no? Y en la coalición en la que ustedes representan, ¿cómo ven esta parte? Porque histórica de esta etapa histórica de la humanidad, parece fundamental eso.
Creo que mi español no es bastante bien para traducir. Pero ¿hay alguien que puede traducir en inglés? Ok, mejor que yo.
He said that power stigmatizes and divides people, and he's concerned about how immigrants are being viewed. Of people are we striving to become as immigrants? How does your organization and you, where do you see this going towards immigrants? How as a coalition, how do you see a construct of these new elements of unity?
Gracias.
Sure. There's a couple of things I'll say. One, something that's given me so much optimism has been how the issue of immigration and protecting immigrant communities has really permeated all issues. So, we have supporters from Planned Parenthood to environmental groups to and so far-ranging coming out to support immigrant communities. And I think, there's a recognition that right now immigrants are under extreme threat and incredibly vulnerable. And so everyone needs to step up, and we've seen it, and it's been pretty incredible. So that's one answer. I think the second answer is that, we need to figure out what it means to really mobilize, to organize and mobilize, and to really be able to activate allied communities, and what that actually looks like, and how do we put plans in place to make sure that we're protecting our immigrant brothers and sisters. So, I think both of those are in the works and happening, and still have a long way to go.
Also wanted to ask, what type of actions do you think would be conductive to, let's say, Democrats? I'm sorry. Chuck Schumer talks a good game, no? But then when it comes down right to it, 3 days later you break. And it's insane. We go out, we march, we rally, we write letters, we call, still in the same position. These kids are being separated from their parents, and so I don't know what else to do. We make the calls, we do what we need to do, and still, as a country, as a nation, as people, nobody's listening to us. Then we look at these immigrants. I was born here, but I consider myself an immigrant. And we want to divide people as, oh, he's a lawyer, that child is studying to be a doctor. What about their parents that wash dishes or have to clean a bathroom? they're just as valuable. And we keep dividing people based on all these different things, and it's insane. I don't care if they're lawyers, cleaning my bathroom, people, and we all have the same rights. So how do we make a difference, a real difference towards that?
I just want to say, because I think there's a really important connection between those two questions. And for me, that's why the lamppost banners is just personally one of the most powerful parts of the exhibition, is that, you know, each of these people is from a different place and has a different circumstance, and all of the people that we're talking about here, you know, in this situation, who are being, let's say, you know, persecuted or you know, having these challenges, these walls thrown up against them, they are as well. And, you know, Weiwei treated Einstein the same way that he treated, you know, a historic immigrant to this country, to someone who's currently a refugee and trying to find a place. And I think that's really the answer, is that we're all people and we all have so much to offer, and that if you you know, you welcome someone and you give them the opportunity to grow and to achieve what they can, you know, they can be the next Einstein, they can be the next you know, person who's going to come up with an idea that's going to change the world. And that's been a part of the reason why this country has as many Nobel Prizes as it does, right? So I think that's at least my take of it. You know, one way is it is about perception, and it's about empathy and about encouraging people, you know, to know that even there were challenges that faced immigrants historically, and continue to be, but they can persist, and we need to help encourage them to do so.
On the Chuck Schumer question, it's a good one. I wish I had the silver bullet. I don't, and, you know, all I can say is that I'm not giving up, and our folks are not giving up, and that's not an option, right? And we know that the parents of DACA recipients were the original dreamers. They were the ones that risked everything to move here for a better life for their kids. And we're not going to let the other side divide us or pit us against each other. And a part of the reason that I wanted to talk about legal immigration in my opening remarks is that's what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to say, well, don't care about diversity visas, you're gonna get legalized as a dreamer. Well, no, that's not how we work, and that's not how we build power, that's not how we win. So one thing you can do is stay up to date with everything that the NYIC is doing. We have a text service. So if people want to take out their phones, you can text to the number 864-237, and you text the word NYIC. So 864-237, and you text the word NYIC. But like I said, next Wednesday, the 7th, we have a bus going to DC to join with people from across the country, and the day before the spending bill. And we're going to be phone banking all next week, so, you know.
So I read Kevin Jennings' recent op-ed piece, who's, I guess, the president of this museum, and he basically shoots down the argument that some people make, quote, my ancestors came here legally, so you should too, because like the previous gentleman said, we really didn't have an immigration policy until 1924, besides the Chinese Exclusion Act. So our immigration policy is really very young in this country. So I want to know if there is a country, in your opinions, that has a model immigration policy, and what is or should be the goal of an immigration policy.
That's a really excellent question that you can tell we all need a moment to think about.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know if there's a country, I don't know what country has an immigration policy that we should model of. I guess I would say that there are definitely improvements that can be made to our current immigration system. You know, like I said, we have hundreds of thousands of people in a backlog that are waiting sometimes decades to be reunited with their families. We have hundreds of thousands of people as, you know, on temporary work visas who have been here for decades and who can't naturalize and become citizens. We obviously have, you know, dreamers and their parents who are stuck in this limbo. But it's really hard, I guess, at least for me right now, to think offensively because we are facing so many attacks. And the last time that we tried to do comprehensive immigration reform in this country in 2013, we got a really imperfect bill. We got a bill that, moved us forward in some ways and moved us really backwards in others. And so, I don't know that we know what the right answer is yet. I think that there are countries we can look to as examples. We've seen what Germany has done in accepting Syrian and other refugees in numbers far greater than we have. But, I don't know beyond that right now that that's something that we should take on.
Yeah, I think Germany was the first country that came to mind for me as well, just looking at which countries seem to have learned from their past, and the legislation that had happened in previous decades. And certainly the U.S. is at a moment where we don't seem to be learning from the past of our legislative mistakes. But it's always interesting, too, having visitors on museum tours from Canada or Australia who are generally held up as our peers as far as immigration policy, because while there are many things that I think both of those countries do better than we do, there are also things that those countries don't do as well as we do as far as immigrant integration. And I think what's interesting for us to think about at the museum is not so much the arrival and who can come here, but how we do create welcoming communities for immigrants once they are here, and what does integration look like in different countries, and what is available for immigrants to help them integrate into different communities, because that's where I think some of the on-the-ground work can really be done. And I know that's a lot of what NYC, you all do a lot of work around that as well as the policy work that you do.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd say about that is because family immigration constitutes about 70% of our immigration green cards right now, families are the cornerstone of immigrant integration. If you're joining a family member in this country here who can help you integrate into society, you're going to do so much better than if you just come here by yourself. I mean, that's, Einstein might not have come to this country if he hadn't been able to bring his sister, who he was, on a sibling visa, right? We're not going to be able to recruit, attract the best and the brightest if we tell them you can't bring your parents, you can't bring your siblings, you can't bring your kids. So that's part of it. Families are important for so many reasons.
So just looking at the clock, I think we have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
So hi, right here. I've kind of 2 questions about 2 long-term trends that are happening now, right? So like with the development of technology and stuff, each generation in the future is going to be more and more educated overall. And since, like in the news right now, it seems like the argument from Democrat side and the Republican side is mostly about talking about like merit-based system versus the lottery system, right? I do have a clarification that I wanted you guys to know, talk about, because I'm not sure if our current system is a mix of the two or is it only lottery system, because from kind of what the Republicans talk about, it seems like it's purely lottery system that we have right now. And do you see that us trending towards a mix of the two as kind of the future, because people in the future are more and more easily like qualified to come here anyway? And my second question is, we've talked about a lot of immigration from other countries and migration from other countries. The second long-term trend I wanted you guys' thoughts on is kind of the slow death of the rural counties in America, right? Urbanization is a long-term trend, and more people will leave the rural areas to come to cities over time. And do you see any policies or any things that we would do to help this transition, much like we're helping other immigrants from other countries?
I can answer the first question. So right now, our immigration system is about, we We do about 1 million green cards a year, issue about 1 million green cards a year. About 70% of that is through family-based immigration. About 4% is through the diversity visa lottery program that I mentioned. And then the rest is through employment-based, or some might consider that merit-based or skill-based, but you have to already have an employer here in this country who will sponsor you. So right now we are predominantly a family-based immigration system. And the one thing that I would just note is that all the studies have shown that people who come on family-based immigration visas do just as well economically and contribute just as much economically to this country as those who come on employment-based visas. So the other thing I would say is that the Republican proposals that have been put forward don't actually increase the number of quote-unquote merit-based, they only cut family-based. So their goal is to reduce legal immigration altogether, and the way that they do that is by reducing family immigration. So they don't actually increase the number of employment-based or merit-based green cards that are available. And so, you know, like I said at the beginning, their goal is to reduce the number of immigrants altogether that are coming to this country.
And I don't know if any of us have a good response to the next question. You can tell we all live in cities. But, you know, one of the things that I think has been interesting is just to see how even smaller cities and smaller places have been completely revitalized by immigration and by immigrants moving there. I mean, I'm from a small suburb outside of Philadelphia, and a town 2 towns over from where my parents live has been completely brought up from economic decline by the opening of businesses by Mexican immigrants there. And it's been really exciting to see. And I think that there is that potential if communities are able to be open enough in their policy for their, you know, cities and smaller cities and towns to be revitalized by immigrant newcomers. Yeah. So I know I said that we had time for one more question, but unfortunately I think it's time to close out the evening. We'll be happy to answer questions after this, but I mean, I just want to end us on this note of how inspirational it's been to hear your thoughts and to hear your commitment to discussing some of these questions with, I don't know if any of you are our actual neighbors, but certainly discussing these questions in public spaces and in museums is what we hope from these talks at the Tenement Museum. That being able to hear from all of you, and certainly for me to hear from you, Anu, and you, Daniel, is to me what is so important right now, that we keep talking to each other, you know, about policy, about art, about each other, and about our stories, and hopefully through that see some change that we want to see. So thank you all so much. Please see the artwork, check out what NYIC does, and come visit the museum if you haven't. And have a great rest of your night.